Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. In this column, the writer talks about the role of local bodies in delivering primary health care. See, our local bodies or local governments play a key role in delivering primary health care as they are the grassroots institutions. So, in urban areas, our urban local bodies, such as municipals, councils, and corporations, and our rural local bodies, such as the Panchayati Raj institutions, they play a direct role in delivering primary health care and in taking care of public health services. This radical administrative change was introduced in 1992 through the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment, which provided for the establishment of our urban and rural local bodies with constitutional status. Following this amendment, the subject of public health was transferred to these grassroots institutions, and they were expected to bring in a radical reform in healthcare. While these constitutional changes were well intentioned and were designed to improve public healthcare delivery, it did have an unintentional adverse effect on primary healthcare, particularly in urban areas. Because following the creation of these local bodies, the Panchayati Raj institutions in the rural areas started getting their share of devolution of funds from the center and the states, along with increased funding through other national programs. But however, it dealt a severe blow to urban health services as the funding to urban local bodies was affected due to several administrative factors. First and foremost, the government funding for urban primary health care was not channeled through the state health department, and this created problems in channeling the funds to the grassroots because in different states, the urban local bodies fell under different departments. Then the urban local bodies on their own did not increase their financial allocation for public health because they were either facing a shortage of resources or they had completely different spending priorities. So, as a result, public health funding for urban local bodies was affected after the introduction of the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment. Whereas rural local bodies saw a slight improvement in the quality of public health care due to additional funding, but nevertheless, the quality of healthcare in the rural areas as well was not up to mark. So, to address these deficiencies, in 2005, the National Rural Health Mission was launched with specific focus on boosting healthcare funding for the rural local bodies. So, while this program did deliver better results in rural healthcare, again the urban areas were largely neglected with regard to public health. Nearly 8 years later, in 2013, the National Urban Health Mission was launched, but however, it failed to address the challenges because a very meager allocation was made under the National Urban Health Mission. Under this urban component of the health mission, less than 1,000 crores were allotted, which was hardly around 3% of the budgetary allocation given to NRHM. So, contrary to popular perception, when it comes to public health care at the primary level, rural areas generally tend to perform better than the urban areas. See, urban India has just around half the rural population. But despite that, urban India just has around one-sixth of the primary health centers as compared to the rural areas. So, contrary to what many think, urban primary healthcare services are actually weaker than what is available in rural India. This is of grave concern because urban health centers are struggling to deal with regular outbreaks of diseases such as dengue, chikungunya, and now the pandemic. While the picture in the rural areas might be slightly better when it comes to primary health, the rural healthcare centers still suffer on the account of quality of healthcare services. So while the rural local bodies seem to have better funding as compared to urban local bodies, and while they seem to have adequate facilities as compared to urban areas, the quality of service really suffers in the rural areas as compared to the urban areas. So, when it comes to primary public health in urban areas, urban local bodies fall short on the count of both facilities and quality of service. So, in the context of this falling healthcare quality and services at the level of local bodies, the 15th Finance Commission came out with a landmark recommendation. It recommended the provision of a dedicated health grant to local bodies, that is, to both rural and urban local bodies, and it has provided for a devolution of funds to the tune of nearly 70,000 crore rupees, which is to be devolved by the centre directly to the local bodies over a span of 5 years. This key recommendation of the 15th Finance Commission has been recently implemented by the Department of Expenditure of the Ministry of Finance, and earlier this month, it has sanctioned the release of the first batch of funds amounting to nearly 8,453 crore rupees for the current financial year. The writer points out that even though this appears to be a small grant, it provides a very big opportunity for the local bodies to transform primary health care, as it enables them to deliver on their mandate with regard to the provision of public health services at the grassroots. The writer calls this opportunity as a springboard, which has to be utilized by all the stakeholders to further boost funding for primary health care and to truly enable our grassroots institutions to deliver quality health care at the local level. Now that the center has released the first batch of funding as recommended by the 15th Finance Commission, the writer provides for a set of suggestions that could be implemented at the local bodies to turn this grant into a big opportunity for healthcare reforms at the grassroots. First, he suggests that all the stakeholders in local bodies should be sensitized so that they are better aware of the opportunity that is being created through these additional funds. So, this would require better awareness and preparedness on the part of elected representatives, such as panchayat members, councillors, and ward members, and as well as amongst the administrators of these local bodies, so that they could put these funds to right use in order to fulfill the responsibility of local bodies in delivering primary healthcare and public healthcare. Second, he suggests creating more awareness amongst the citizens, because when citizens are aware of this additional funding being received by their respective local bodies, it will become a tool for empowerment in their hands, as they could then hold their elected representatives and their administrators accountable for the delivery of basic healthcare services and as well as for their failures. Over here, the civil society organizations will also play an important role, because they will have to work with citizen groups to spread awareness about the importance of these additional funds being received by local bodies. And they could also play a key role in ensuring accountability of the local bodies by putting in place a monitoring and tracking system to track the progress of healthcare initiatives taken up by the local bodies. Then, in addition to these funds being devolved by the center, the local bodies themselves will also have to increase their own spending on healthcare through their own budget, so that adequate resources are made available at the grassroots to create all the required facilities for delivering quality healthcare. Then it would also require better coordination amongst multiple agencies such as the State Health Department, the Rural Development and Panchayati Raj Ministry, and all these institutions of the center and the state will have to coordinate with the local bodies in order to deliver tangible results at the grassroots. Then finally, the administrators of these local bodies will have to work with the elected representatives and the citizens within their jurisdiction to come out with innovative health models that are customized to suit the local context. And these endeavors of the local bodies will have to be supported by the state governments by providing for the establishment of community level clinics, as seen in the successful model of Mohalla clinics set up by the Delhi government. So, such all round coordination between the center, state, and the local bodies, involving active participation from the citizens and the civil society, can truly deliver results with regard to public health care at the primary level, because this dedicated health allocation recommended by the 15th Finance Commission represents a great opportunity for paying greater attention to primary health care at the local level. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6, which deals with the right to free speech and expression, which is a guaranteed fundamental right under Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. Of late in India, this fundamental right of artists, comedians, and as well as the right to expression of writers, thinkers, and intellectuals has been threatened by fringe radical violent outfits. And unfortunately, the governments and the police have failed to defend this fundamental right. Over the years, we have seen a disturbing trend where a few radical violent elements in the Indian society seem to take offense towards jokes, articles, opinions, paintings, and cartoons. Recently, we have seen instances of comedians like Veer Das and Munawar Farooqi who have been repeatedly targeted by fringe radical outfits for expressing their opinions. This is not just a trend that we are witnessing in the last few years. In the past as well, artists such as M.F. Hussain and several prominent cartoonists have also been subjected to similar threats by radical and vociferous groups. Then even writers such as Salman Rushdie and as well as Bangladeshi writer Taslima Nasreen and Tamil writer Perumal Murugan have all faced similar threats to their right to free speech and expression. Even thinkers and intellectuals like Ramchandra Guha and several journalists also face similar threats whenever they express their critical opinion against governments, leaders, and religions. We have seen similar controversies erupting around movies as well, such as Padmavat, where the artistic expression of the creators is curbed on the basis of a perceived sense of offense taken by these radical outfits. These outfits, which claim to represent a community or their religion, tend to use threats and intimidation to snatch away the right to free speech and expression of these artists and writers. Now, this is completely unacceptable in a free and democratic state because every individual has the right for critical speech and expression, and it is a guaranteed fundamental right under Article 19. Every individual has a right to express opinions against governments or to make fun of leaders or to raise critical points against religions. But of course, this fundamental right is not an absolute right. It does come with a set of reasonable restrictions, and this right to free speech and expression can be curbed by the state if it leads to the incitement of violence or affects decency or morality, or if it disrupts public order. But this is a matter to be decided by the courts and not by the mobs, and definitely not by chauvinist violent groups, which are using intimidation and blackmail as a tactic to achieve their political purposes. If the government and the police fail to protect this right of artists and writers, then it will end up having a chilling effect on the right to free speech and expression of citizens. But unfortunately, over the last 2 to 3 decades, the center and state governments and their respective police forces have failed to defend this right, and instead they often put pressure on the artists and the writers to either cancel their shows or desist from writing or expressing their opinion. And in several cases, they even go on to register complaints based on the claims made by these groups. And subsequently, several artists have even been arrested and denied bail on unjustifiable grounds. Eventually, when these cases reach the courts clearly take a stand towards protection of free speech because, in their interpretation, these reasonable restrictions do not apply. And the courts have repeatedly pointed out that it is the duty of the government and the police to protect the right to free speech of its citizens without falling for the intimidating blackmailing tactics of radical violent outfits. In fact, the Supreme Court itself laid down a precedent for this by delivering a landmark judgment in 1989 in the S. Rangarajan versus P. Jagjeevan Ram case. In this case, the Supreme Court had observed that suppressing free speech of individuals in response to threat of demonstration or protest or possible violence would amount to negating the rule of law, and it would be a surrender of the government and the police to blackmail and intimidation. So while the courts have often taken the right position on this controversial issue, our governments and our police forces have often fallen to the blackmailing tactics of these groups mainly for political and electoral reasons. So the editorial remarks that such suppression of free speech by yielding to threats has become an unfortunate norm, and hence it's calling upon the governments and the police to do their duty and to protect the right to free speech and not pander to the unjustified demands of these violent radical outfits. Now let's look at another column from page number 6, in which the writer examines the rise of Afghanistan as a narco terrorist state and how this poses a grave threat to India's internal security. See, it's a well established fact that drug production and drug trafficking is closely related with several other types of organized crime, including arms trafficking, and it also shares close connections with money laundering and terrorist financing. So, wherever drug production has flourished, it has been noticed that terrorism and insurgency also flourishes due to the easy availability of terror finance, money laundering channels, and the presence of various other illicit and criminal activities. The CIA of the United States has identified three such drug production hubs of the world which have ended up fueling narco terrorism. The first such region is centered around Central America and stretches all the way from Colombia in South America to Mexico in North America. This is one major hub of narco terrorism where drug production and drug trafficking has thrived with organized criminal activities and money laundering and terror financing. The other two hubs are located in and around India. Towards our western borders, we have the Golden Crescent region, which includes parts of Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, which is one of the major hubs for drug production and drug trafficking. Then, towards our eastern borders, we have the Golden Triangle region that stretches across countries such as Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So, since India is surrounded by two such hotspots for drug production and drug trafficking, it also faces a grave security threat posed by terror outfits and insurgent groups and organized criminal cartels, as India becomes a dumping ground and a transit point for these drugs, which eventually enables the financing of terror activities and other criminal activities. In fact, getting involved in drug production and drug trafficking and other criminal activities is one of the preferred methods for terror outfits and insurgent groups to raise finances for their operations. For example, several extremist groups like Al Qaeda, Islamic State, the Taliban, Hezbollah, and even the FARC of Colombia, and as well as LTTE of Sri Lanka, and several Northeast insurgent groups, and even the Naxals, they all rely on drug trafficking and controlling drug production as a method of raising revenue for their terrorist and insurgent activities. In the case of Afghanistan, since several decades, the Afghan warlords, many of whom make up the Taliban, have been producing opium on a massive scale, which in turn is trafficked around the world with the help of Pakistani agencies like the ISI, along with the help of other Pakistan based extremist groups. So now the fall of Afghanistan into the hands of Taliban has raised serious concerns about Afghanistan turning into a failed state, which could further fuel its rise as a narco terrorist state. The biggest threat for India is that several anti India terror outfits, like the Lashkar e Toiba, the Jaish e Mohammed, and the others, they all share close links with these outfits like the Al Qaeda and the Taliban, and they're all eventually connected to the narco networks that exist in the Afghanistan Pakistan belt. Since many decades, Afghan drugs have found a way into India through several routes, either through the air route, where several carriers try to smuggle drugs into India, or through the work of organized criminal drug cartels operating out of countries such as Pakistan, Sri Lanka, African nations like South Africa and Mozambique, and even Gulf countries like Qatar and UAE. Through all these routes, including through the sea route, Afghan drugs have often been infiltrated into India, and this has always led to serious security problems for India. Take, for example, how the Khalistan movement in Punjab was fueled with Afghan drug money back in the 1980s with the direct support of Pakistani state agencies like the ISI. So now the same concerns are back for India as Taliban has taken over Afghanistan and drug production has gone up to record levels in the country. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, or UNODC, has noted that opium production in Afghanistan has crossed 6,000 tons for the fifth consecutive year. So, this also explains the huge recoveries being made in India, such as the recent seizure of around 3 tons of heroin at the Mundra port in Gujarat, along with the usage of the Afghanistan Iran route to smuggle drugs into India through the Sea Link. The United Nations has estimated that Taliban alone managed to raise around $400 million in revenue over the years by smuggling drugs. And even if a part of it falls into the hands of groups like Lashkar and Jaish-e-Mohammed, it will pose a very significant threat to India's national security. Even the US government is of the opinion that Taliban raises nearly 60% of its annual revenue through illicit trafficking of narcotics. And even liberal European countries have come to agree that drug production and drug trafficking and its links with terrorism poses a dangerous threat to free and democratic societies. So, considering these grave implications, the time has come for India to work with like minded countries such as the United States and the European countries to formulate a viable solution to tackle the trafficking and production of drugs in Afghanistan. While India is pursuing such global efforts along with the United Nations, it is also taking a regional approach to the issue, and this was very evident during a regional conference on Afghanistan, which was organized by India's National Security Advisor. Just around 20 days back, the Delhi Regional Security Dialogue was held by India, and through such regional initiatives, India is trying to create a regional coalition with like minded countries in West Asia, in Central Asia, and in South Asia, so that through a collaborated response, we can tackle the menace of drug trafficking and its links with money laundering and terror financing. Apart from these initiatives, India will also have to work with Afghanistan, especially with the country's civil society and women groups, and as well as with the political and business representatives of Afghanistan to ensure that the Taliban government is inclusive and functions as a responsible representative of the country. While the Taliban may not be willing to give up its biggest revenue source, India will have to continue exerting global and regional pressure by working with like minded countries and organizations, and will also have to push for internal changes within the Afghan society so that the Taliban government can be pushed away from its reliance on drug revenue. This would require the global community to ensure that Afghanistan does not become a failed state, and hence it's of utmost importance to prevent the complete economic collapse of Afghanistan. And all the major countries, along with the UN, have to work with the Taliban government to create adequate livelihood opportunities in Afghanistan so that the opium farmers can be pulled away from opium cultivation in order to effectively check the menace created by drug production and drug trafficking. Now let's look at this column from page number 7, which deals with cryptocurrencies. This has become a hot trending topic as of now, not just because of massive investor interest in cryptocurrencies, but also because the government is looking to introduce a bill to either regulate or possibly ban cryptocurrencies. And within a few days, the bill is likely to be introduced during the ongoing winter session once it is approved by the Union Cabinet. See, cryptocurrencies from the very beginning have been very controversial since the emergence of the first cryptocurrency, which was Bitcoin. Today, we have seen the emergence of hundreds of other crypto and digital currencies, including gaming tokens, and as well as NFTs or non fungible tokens. See, most of these cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the others, and as well as other digital assets like gaming tokens and NFTs, they're all based on a revolutionary technology known as the blockchain. This essentially provides for a decentralized currency and a decentralized accounting and payment system. So, this is radically different from a traditional economy where the fiat currencies or the legal tender is tightly regulated in a centralized environment by the government and by the central banks. Governments and central banks primarily derive their authority from here as they control the fiat currency and the legal tender, and hence they were bound to resist the decentralized nature of cryptocurrencies. Because cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin is not regulated or controlled by any central authority, but instead it is entirely managed through a peer to peer network that functions on a digital ledger or on a digital register known as the blockchain. While the blockchain technology represents tremendous opportunities and applications, there have been serious concerns raised about the potential misuse of cryptocurrencies. Due to its decentralized anonymous nature, cryptocurrencies have often been misused by cybercriminals, and they've also been used to enable money laundering and terror financing. Upon this, cryptocurrencies do not have any inherent value of their own, and this has often led to intensive speculation in the crypto markets, thereby resulting in massive price volatility. So these concerns surrounding cryptocurrencies poses an economic threat and as well as a national security threat, and hence governments and central banks around the world have rushed to take a stand against cryptocurrencies, and they have either sought to regulate them, and some countries have even tried banning cryptocurrencies altogether. In the case of India, cryptocurrencies have been under the scanner of the central government and the RBI from 2013 itself, because back then the RBI had issued a notice asking investors and banks to be cautious while dealing with the crypto markets. Later in 2018, the government even constituted an interministerial committee to come out with recommendations to deal with the cryptocurrencies, and this committee recommended an outright ban on all cryptocurrencies. Then, around the same period, the RBI issued a notification to all banks asking them to completely stop all transactions with crypto exchanges and crypto wallets. This imposed a virtual ban on cryptocurrencies in India, and last year, in 2020, the Supreme Court stepped in on the basis of a petition and revoked this notification of the RBI, thereby opening up the crypto world in India. Along with the uncertainties created by the pandemic, this ruling of the Supreme Court led to an exponential surge in India's crypto market. And today, even though the sector is not regulated by the government, millions of Indians have already invested heavily in cryptocurrencies. And according to several reports, nearly 40,000 crore rupees has been invested in the sector. Over the last 1 to 2 years, several crypto based startups have come up in India, and they have even managed to generate a massive subscriber base for themselves. So, considering this growing proliferation of cryptocurrencies and considering the risk faced by millions of investors, the government finally decided to act. And earlier this year, it proposed a draft bill which sought a possible ban on most private cryptocurrencies, along with enabling the RBI to introduce its own official digital currency. This proposal of an outright ban led to protests from the crypto industry and the investors, and has forced the government to hold a series of consultations with all the stakeholders. Based on these consultations, the government has revised and updated the bill, and very soon it is going to be placed in front of the cabinet for approval, following which it will be introduced in the parliament during the ongoing winter session. As of now, there is no clarity on the exact provisions of the bill, but it is being speculated that it might ban cryptocurrencies, at least most of the private cryptocurrencies, whereas giving few exceptions to allow the exploitation of advantages offered by blockchain technology. But it is also being reported that the government may not go for an outright ban. Instead, it might try to regulate the crypto market in order to protect the interests of the investors and as well as to protect the economic and national security of the country. In the process, the government would also be looking to raise revenue for itself by taxing crypto transactions and crypto profits. So we need to wait and watch as to what exactly would be the provisions of the bill. But however, if you look at global examples, countries like China have imposed an outright ban on all cryptocurrencies, and it has also introduced its own digital currency known as the digital renminbi. whereas small countries like El Salvador became the first country to adopt cryptocurrency and it has officially accepted Bitcoin as legal tender. Then there are other countries like Canada, Japan, Thailand, and even the US, which are not pushing for an outright ban on cryptocurrencies, but instead they are looking to regulate the market and they're also looking to tax the transactions and the profits to generate revenue for the government. Then few countries like Canada and Thailand and Japan have even allowed payments to be done in cryptocurrencies. So around the world, different routes are being followed when it comes to regulation of cryptocurrencies. But we need to wait and watch as to what India is going to do when it comes to the regulation of cryptocurrencies and the introduction of its own official digital currency. Recently, the Prime Minister expressed concern about how cryptocurrencies are being misused, and he even called upon all democratic nations to come together to form a coalition so that a global framework could be brought out to regulate cryptocurrencies. So the writer points out that banning cryptocurrencies at a national level would be impossible considering the decentralized nature of cryptocurrencies and the blockchain technology. So one country alone simply cannot impose a total ban on cryptocurrencies because despite a ban, they will remain accessible through several other routes that are available on a decentralized internet. At the maximum, the government and the RBI can prohibit all banks from transacting with exchanges and wallets, and all the India based crypto exchanges and wallets could be prohibited. Then holding cryptocurrencies and transacting with them could also be criminalized. While these strict measures might restrict and slow down crypto investments and transactions within the country, it will still not be effective in enforcing a total ban because the global decentralized nature of cryptocurrencies will allow them to be accessible in some way or the other. So, in this regard, the writer welcomes the suggestion of the Prime Minister for forming a global alliance for regulating cryptocurrencies because cryptocurrencies can be truly controlled and regulated only when all the countries act and work together. But however, he recommends that an outright ban will not truly serve any purpose. So instead, it would be better for the government to use this bill to regulate the crypto market so that the interests of the investors can be protected along with the economic and national security of the nation while imposing taxes on transactions and profits, which will help generate valuable revenue to the government. Plus, if we try to ban cryptocurrencies, it will also prevent innovations around blockchain technology, which can find many other wide applications. So, the blockchain and crypto industry in India has already nurtured many startups, and thousands of jobs have been created. And India would do well to further capitalize on this by regulating the market instead of banning it altogether. So, in the coming days as well, we are going to have more discussions on cryptocurrencies because we are going to get more clarity on this issue once the government brings out the bill and tables it in the parliament. Now, let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: illustrate how the health allocation recommended by the 15th Finance Commission can fulfill a mandate on primary care at the level of local governments. The second question: suppression of free speech by yielding to threats has become an unfortunate norm. Discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So, this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.